On April 18, 1861, a 67-year-old former congressman named Francis Preston Blair sat down in his Washington townhouse across from a 54-year-old colonel and asked him a question that would alter the shape of American history. Blair was not speaking for himself. He was speaking, by his own account, and by Abraham Lincoln's later confirmation, with the President's direct knowledge and blessing. The offer he carried was as close to unprecedented as anything in the early days of that crisis. Field command of the United States Army, the force that would need to suppress the rebellion, just declared 4 days earlier at Fort Sumter. Lincoln wanted Robert E. Lee. Lee did not say yes. Lee did not say no, not immediately. He said he would need time to consider the matter fully, and he left Blair's house that afternoon and walked directly to the office of General Winfield Scott, the aging commanding general of the United States Army, and a man who had known Lee personally since Lee was a young officer serving under him in Mexico. Scott, who wanted Lee for the position as badly as Lincoln did, told him plainly that there was no way to remain neutral in what was coming. Lee went home to Arlington that night and did not sleep. His wife Mary later wrote that she heard him pacing the floor of the room above hers for hours. 2 days after that, on April 20th, Lee wrote his letter of resignation from the United States Army he had served for 32 years, and 4 days after that, he accepted command of the military forces of Virginia. The man Lincoln wanted to lead the Union to victory instead led the resistance that came within a hair's breadth of destroying the Union altogether. What happened in that room in those 4 days and in the 3 decades of a career that preceded them is one of the strangest turns in American history. A story about a man so admired by both sides that the President of the United States tried to hand him an army, and who turned that army down for reasons that had almost nothing to do with slavery, almost nothing to do with the Confederacy as an idea, and almost everything to do with a single word that mattered to Robert E. Lee more than any other: home. Lee's path to that April afternoon began at Arlington itself, in a marriage that gave him a life he had not been born into. He came from a family whose name carried weight and whose finances did not. His father, Henry Lee, known during the American Revolution as Light Horse Harry for his cavalry exploits under Washington, had been a genuine war hero and a genuine financial catastrophe, cycling through debtor's prison and speculative schemes that left the family name distinguished and the family accounts empty. Robert was 6 years old when his father left for the Caribbean to escape creditors and never returned, dying on the trip home when Robert was 11. He grew up in Alexandria, in a household managed by his mother, Ann Carter Lee, whose own family connections to the Virginia planter aristocracy gave young Robert social standing that his father's failures could not entirely erase, but whose actual financial resources were modest enough that West Point, free, prestigious, and a path to a stable career, was less an ambition than a practical necessity. Ann Carter Lee was chronically ill for most of Robert's childhood, and by his teenage years he had effectively become her caretaker, managing household accounts and nursing duties that would have normally fallen to servants in a family of greater means. Biographers have long pointed to those years as the origin of the almost severe self-discipline that defined Lee as an adult, a boy who learned early that the family's dignity depended on his own restraint because there was very little else left to depend on. He excelled there in a way that has become part of the Lee mythology, but is nonetheless documented fact. He graduated second in his class in 1829 without a single demerit in 4 years, a record that no cadet before him had matched and that remained essentially unrepeated. This was not simply academic talent. It reflected a temperament, controlled, disciplined, almost unnervingly self-possessed, that would define his entire military career and eventually make him, by 1861, the most respected officer in the United States Army under Scott himself. The marriage that gave Lee Arlington came in 1831 when he married Mary Anna Randolph Custis, the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington and the daughter of George Washington Parke Custis, who had built Arlington House as a monument to his adoptive grandfather. Lee married into the closest thing early America had to a royal inheritance: the Washington name, Washington relics displayed throughout the house, an estate perched on a hill overlooking the young capital city with the Potomac River, and the unfinished Capitol dome visible from its front portico. When Custis died in 1857, Lee inherited responsibility for Arlington and for the roughly 200 enslaved people on the estate, along with a will that stipulated they were to be freed within 5 years. A clause Lee spent those 5 years administering with a rigor that some historians read as reluctant compliance and others read as active delay. And the record supports both readings depending on which correspondence you weight most heavily. By the time secession crisis reached its breaking point in the winter of 1860 and spring of 1861, Lee held a reputation that placed him at the very top of the United States officer corps. He had distinguished himself in the Mexican-American War under Scott's direct observation, performing reconnaissance work at Cerro Gordo and Chapultepec that Scott himself credited as decisive to American victories, and Scott did not distribute credit loosely. At Cerro Gordo in April 1847, Lee scouted a path through terrain the Mexican army had judged impassable, guiding an American flanking column along a route that avoided a fortified position and forced a Mexican withdrawal. Scott later called it the finest piece of reconnaissance he had witnessed in his entire career, a career that by then stretched back to the War of 1812. At Chapultepec, during the final assault on Mexico City, Lee was wounded slightly and rode for 2 straight days without rest, coordinating artillery placement, and he emerged from the campaign with 3 brevet promotions for gallantry, an extraordinary rate of advancement that marked him in the eyes of every senior officer who observed him as the most capable engineer in the Army. Lee had served as superintendent of West Point from 1852 to 1855, modernizing the curriculum and personally supervising cadets who would, within a decade, be shooting at each other across battlefields neither side could yet imagine. He had commanded the detachment of Marines that captured John Brown at Harper's Ferry in October 1859, an assignment that placed him, almost by accident, at the exact geographic and symbolic hinge point where the sectional crisis would soon turn violent. Lee happened to be in Washington on leave from his post in Texas when word reached the War Department that an armed group had seized the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, and he was given command of the response simply because he was the most senior officer available on short notice, not because of any particular expertise in the matter. He led the storming of the engine house where Brown and his remaining men had barricaded themselves, and the operation took less than 3 minutes once Lee gave the order. Brown was captured alive, tried, and hanged within 2 months, and the entire episode hardened sectional feeling on both sides in ways that historians now recognize as one of the direct accelerants of the secession crisis that followed within 18 months. Lee wrote a report on the incident that was notably restrained in tone, describing Brown's actions as those of a fanatic rather than dwelling on the broader political implications. And at the time, he had no reason to suspect that the next great crisis of federal authority would arrive at his own front door and force him to choose a side rather than simply enforce the law on behalf of one. So when the crisis actually arrived, when South Carolina seceded in December 1860, when 6 more states followed by February, when Fort Sumter fell in mid-April, Lee was not an obscure colonel being elevated beyond his qualifications. He was the obvious choice, the man both Scott and Lincoln independently identified as the single best available officer to lead what everyone expected at that early stage would be a brief and limited military action to restore federal authority in the South. Nobody in Washington in April 1861 anticipated 4 years of Continental War. They anticipated something closer to a large-scale policing action, and for that action, Lee was the man. The reasoning Lee gave for declining in his own letters from those days was neither complicated nor evasive, though it has been interpreted in wildly different ways ever since. He wrote to his sister Ann Marshall, who lived in Baltimore and whose own son would go on to fight for the Union, that he looked upon secession as anarchy, that he had no sympathy for the political logic of dissolving the Union, and that if he owned every enslaved person in the South, he would give them all up to save the Union. That letter is genuine, and it is often cited by people arguing that Lee's decision had nothing to do with any enthusiasm for the Confederate cause. It is equally genuine that in the same breath, in the same letter, Lee wrote that he could not raise his hand against his relatives, his children, his home. Virginia had not yet seceded when Blair made the offer on April 18th. It seceded on April 17th, the day before, news that had not yet reached Washington through official channels when Lee sat down with Blair, though word of the Virginia Convention's vote was already spreading. By the time Lee made his final decision on April 20th, Virginia's secession was confirmed, and for Lee, that single fact reorganized every other consideration. This is the part of the story that resists the simple narratives people want to impose on it in both directions. Lee was not a man defending slavery as an institution in any ideological sense that his own letters support. His correspondence is, in fact, more critical of slavery in the abstract than that of many Union officers of the period, even as he continued to hold people in bondage at Arlington and managed that inheritance with documented harshness toward enslaved people who attempted escape. He was also not a man who believed secession was constitutionally justified. He said so explicitly and repeatedly. What he was, by his own repeated explanation and by the consistent judgment of nearly every biographer who has examined the record since, was a man for whom loyalty to Virginia specifically, as opposed to loyalty to the United States generally, or to the Confederacy as a political project, was the value that outranked every other consideration in his moral architecture. It is worth being precise about what this means, because it is often misunderstood. Lee's reasoning was not that Virginia's cause was righteous. It was that Virginia was, in the framework of allegiance he had inherited from a generation raised to think of the United States as a voluntary compact of sovereign states rather than a single indivisible nation, his primary political community. The entity to which his oath as an officer ultimately answered once his home state had formally withdrawn from the Union that oath had originally protected. That framework strikes most people today as strange, even indefensible, precisely because the Civil War itself is the event that permanently settled the argument in the other direction. Lee was operating on the losing side of a constitutional question that had not yet been resolved when he made his decision, and the war he then fought helped resolve it. Virginia was not an abstraction to Lee. It was Arlington. It was the graves of his parents. It was the entire social and family world that had made him who he was. When Virginia seceded, in Lee's own accounting, his country had changed, and his obligation followed his country. Winfield Scott, when Lee came to deliver his resignation on April 20th, reportedly told him that he had made the greatest mistake of his life, but that he had feared as much. Scott, who was himself a Virginian by birth and who had remained loyal to the Union despite that fact, understood exactly what Lee was choosing and exactly what it would cost him. Scott had spent 3 decades grooming Lee as his likely successor. He watched that investment walk out the door in the space of a single conversation, and by every account from people who were present or who spoke to Scott afterward, it affected him for the rest of his life. Scott's own position in this story deserves more attention than it usually gets because Scott was himself proof that a senior Virginia-born officer could choose the Union without hesitation. Scott had been born in Dinwiddie County, Virginia, in 1786, 3 decades before Lee, and by 1861 he was 74 years old, the most decorated soldier in American history to that point, and the commanding general of the entire United States Army. When Virginia seceded, Scott did not waver for a single day. He remained loyal to the government he had served since the War of 1812, and he did so publicly and without apparent internal conflict, which makes the contrast with Lee's agonized 4 days all the more striking. Scott and Lee had known each other for more than 2 decades by that point, dating back to the Mexican War campaign, where Scott had personally observed Lee's reconnaissance work and had gone out of his way to promote him. Scott considered Lee not simply a talented subordinate, but very nearly a protege, and the decision Lee made in April 1861 was, for Scott, both a professional loss and something closer to a personal betrayal. Though Scott, by every surviving account, never spoke of Lee's choice with anger. He spoke of it with something closer to grief. The consequences of Lee's decision are, in one sense, the entire remaining story of the Civil War, and this video is not the place to relitigate every campaign. But it is worth sitting with the scale of what changed because one man chose Virginia over Washington on an April afternoon in 1861. Lee did not simply decline a job. He took the military judgment that Scott and Lincoln both regarded as unmatched anywhere in the Federal officer corps and delivered it directly to the opposing side. For the next 4 years, that skill set produced Confederate victories at Second Bull Run, at Fredericksburg, at Chancellorsville, engagements in which Lee's army, consistently outnumbered and consistently undersupplied, inflicted casualties and delays on Union forces that repeatedly extended a war Northern military planners had originally hoped to end within months. At Chancellorsville in May 1863, Lee split his already outnumbered army in the face of a Union force nearly twice its size and won one of the most tactically audacious victories in the history of American warfare, a result that even his opponents studied afterward with something close to professional awe. Union general after Union general, McClellan, Pope, Burnside, Hooker, arrived in command of the Army of the Potomac, believing they could match Lee, and each one left having discovered that they could not until Grant finally arrived in 1864 with a strategy built not around outmaneuvering Lee, but around outlasting him through sheer attritional pressure, because by that point Union commanders had concluded there was no tactical formula that reliably beat Lee in open engagement. Historians have spent a century and a half debating how differently the war might have gone had Lee accepted Lincoln's offer instead of Virginia's claim on him, and the honest answer is that nobody can know with certainty, but few historians dispute that the war would have looked substantially different and quite possibly shorter without Lee commanding the Army of Northern Virginia. What makes the story worth telling is not simply the counterfactual interesting as it is. It is the specific texture of what Lee actually said and did during those 4 days in April, because it captures something about the sectional crisis that gets flattened when the Civil War is described only in terms of grand political forces and economic systems. Lee's decision was not made by an institution or an ideology. It was made by a single exhausted man pacing a floor above his wife's bedroom, weighing an oath he had taken to a government he respected against an identity built from birth around a piece of land, a family name, and a state that had just, in his understanding, ceased to be part of the country he had sworn to serve. Lee's biographer Douglas Southall Freeman, writing decades later in a study that shaped Lee's public reputation for generations of American readers, described those 4 days as the most difficult of Lee's entire life, and nothing in Lee's own surviving correspondence from the period contradicts that judgment in any meaningful way. There is a coda to the Arlington story that adds a final layer of irony to the whole episode. When Lee left Arlington in April 1861 to take command of Virginia's forces, he never returned to live there again. Union forces occupied the estate within weeks, and by 1864, the federal government had begun burying Union war dead on the grounds. A decision made in part, according to the quartermaster general who oversaw it, specifically so that the Lee family could never again treat the property as a private home, even if the war ended in Confederate defeat. Arlington National Cemetery exists today on the ground where Robert E. Lee once stood on his front portico and looked out over the same Potomac River and the same unfinished Capitol dome that had been visible from that spot since his marriage in 1831. The home he chose over Lincoln's offer became the resting place of thousands of the men who died fighting the Army. He ultimately led against the Union. He declined to command. And today, more than 4 million visitors walk those same grounds every year, most of them with little idea that the hill beneath their feet was once the front lawn of the general who came closer than almost anyone in American history to leading the opposite army entirely. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, almost exactly 4 years after Blair's offer and Scott's warning and the sleepless night at Arlington. Grant's terms were generous by the standards of the era. Confederate officers and soldiers were permitted to return home without prosecution for treason, and Lee himself never faced legal consequences for a rebellion that, under a strict reading of federal law, could have cost him his life. He spent his remaining 5 years as president of Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, a position he approached with the same discipline and reserve that had defined his entire career, declining to profit from his fame, generally avoiding public commentary on the war he had fought, and quietly discouraging the erection of Confederate monuments during his own lifetime, a fact that sits uneasily alongside the monument-building movement that would use his name and image for generations after his death. He applied for and never received a formal pardon restoring his United States citizenship during his lifetime, an oversight in the federal bureaucracy that was not corrected until 1975, more than a century after he died in October 1870. The debate over what he chose in April 1861 and why has not stopped since, and it is unlikely to stop now. The offer Lincoln extended through Blair was not a footnote to Lee's career. It was the fork in the road that determined everything that followed, for Lee personally, for the army he would come to command, and for the shape of a war that might have unfolded along an entirely different timeline had a colonel in Washington chosen the uniform he had worn for 3 decades over the house on the hill where he had built his life. He chose the house. The country spent the next 4 brutal years finding out exactly what that single choice, made by one exhausted colonel pacing a floor in the dark, would ultimately cost.